He thought the dog's odd behavior around his daughter was harmless until the shocking truth left him filled with regret. The morning was quiet, a muted softness in the air as Mason held little Jocelyn close, her tiny fingers curling around his as they stood by her mother's grave. The cemetery was vast and still, the trees casting long shadows over the rows of headstones. Mason's heart ached with a heaviness that words couldn't touch. Jocelyn, barely a year old, didn't understand, but he hoped that one day when she was older he could tell her how much her mother had loved her, even in the brief time they had shared. Mason's thoughts drifted back to those early days in the United States, the challenge of carving out a life from scratch. The journey from Colombia had been grueling, a series of small triumphs and unrelenting hardships. He and his wife had worked tirelessly to give Jocelyn a future they had barely dreamed of for themselves. Their little girl was supposed to be their anchor, a reason to keep pushing forward. But just as life began to settle, as their hopes started to shape into something real, cancer had come without warning, stealing his wife in a matter of months. Now, as he gazed down at the simple stone marking her place in the world, the weight of her absence settled around him, thick and consuming. The trip back home was long and silent, Jocelyn dozing softly in his arms. Lost in thought, Mason walked with his head down until something by the roadside caught his eye. A small, scruffy puppy nestled close to the mother dog. For a moment Mason's heart leapt, touched by the sweetness of the scene, until he noticed that the mother dog was completely still, her body lifeless. The puppy, unknowing, suckled, seeking comfort that would never come. A surge of compassion and sorrow swept over him. He saw a reflection of his own pain in the scene, a young creature left alone, its source of love and safety stripped away. Instinctively, he reached down, lifting the small puppy into his arms. "You're all alone too, aren't you?" he murmured, feeling a deep, inexplicable connection. He decided, right then and there, that he couldn't leave this little one behind. When they reached home, Mason laid the puppy, who he decided to name Loki, gently in a box lined with an old towel. He stroked its soft fur as it whimpered, restless in this new place that felt nothing like home. The first night was difficult, Loki's cries piercing the quiet of the house, each whimper tugging at Mason's heart. Loki seemed to sense the absence, the lack of familiar warmth, much like Jocelyn had in those first sleepless nights after her mother was gone. Mason didn't sleep much those early days, staying up with Loki, his hand resting gently on the little creature, comforting him until he finally fell into an exhausted sleep. Every time Loki cried, Mason was there, feeling his own pain mirrored in the helplessness of this small being. He fed him, cared for him, and even took him for short walks in the yard, hoping the routine might soothe both their souls. As days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Loki, once timid and scared, began to warm up, his cries becoming fewer, his spirit more alive. Mason found himself smiling at Loki's small antics, chasing his tail, pawing at dust particles in the sun. Jocelyn, though still very young, seemed to sense the joy in Loki's presence, giggling whenever the puppy came near, reaching out with chubby hands to touch his soft fur. Mason watched them together, realizing that this small creature had brought a flicker of life back into their quiet, grieving home. In Loki, Mason found something he hadn't realized he needed, a companion who understood loss, who bore a silent understanding of the pain of abandonment. Loki wasn't just a pet. He was a reminder of resilience, a small light in the dim, uncertain world Mason was trying to navigate for his daughter. And so, as the three of them moved through those first few months, an unspoken bond grew, knitting their hearts together in a way only shared grief can. Loki wasn't just Jocelyn's playmate or Mason's pet. He was family, a small, steadfast presence that helped them inch, day by day, toward healing. Jocelyn grew up with Loki always by her side, their bond deepening over the years in ways that went beyond words. Loki, the scruffy, loyal dog her father Mason had rescued, was more than just a pet. He was her confidant, her protector, and her best friend. Jocelyn had always treated Loki like a younger brother. Ever since she was little, she'd lean down and whisper her secrets to him, letting him in on every single worry, every tiny triumph, and every dream her young heart held. Loki listened without question, his warm brown eyes fixed on her, full of something that seemed like understanding. Whenever Jocelyn feels lonely, Loki nudges her hand with his cold, wet nose, offering silent support that only they seem to understand. Sometimes she'd lie on the floor next to him, both of them staring up at the ceiling as if they were waiting for the answers to life's mysteries to unfold. In those quiet moments, Loki was everything Jocelyn needed, a steadfast companion, and in a way a part of herself she couldn't find anywhere else. One day Jocelyn came home, her eyes red-rimmed and face taut with the frustration she tried so hard to hide from her dad. The other kids at school had taken things too far, laughing at the hand-me-down jacket her father had given her, the one with the mismatched buttons he had sewn on himself. Mason did his best, she knew that, but sometimes it hurt more than she let on. Loki was there, waiting for her at the door, his tail wagging with that familiar, undemanding joy he always carried. Jocelyn crouched down, wrapping her arms around him, pressing her face into his fur, letting herself be vulnerable in a way she could never manage with anyone else. Loki, why's the world so mean sometimes? She whispered, her voice barely audible, but she knew he understood. His head tilted as he stared at her, his eyes holding a patience that calmed her. It wasn't long before Loki started following her everywhere, even to the bus stop. One particular day, as a group of older kids crowded around her, she tried to step back, but their laughter grew louder. In the midst of it all, Loki darted forward, a low, warning growl rumbling from his chest as he placed himself between her and them. The kids froze, unsure of how to react, and after a tense moment, they finally backed away, grumbling and muttering under their breath. Jocelyn knelt down, resting a hand on his head, feeling the warmth and protection radiating from him like a shield. Mason watched this bond grow stronger each day, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. It wasn't easy, raising Jocelyn alone after everything they'd been through. The struggles of their everyday lives were softened somehow by Loki's presence. He was more than just a pet. He was family. Mason often found himself watching them from a distance, feeling grateful for the unexpected gift Loki had brought into their lives. He knew Jocelyn would be okay as long as Loki was around, as if the dog had taken on the silent promise of keeping her safe and loved. As time passed, Jocelyn and Loki became inseparable. Every memory she made, every moment she cherished, Loki was there, a constant in a world that often felt too uncertain. Whether it was summer afternoons spent lying in the grass, watching clouds drift by, or quiet winter nights, with her head resting on Loki's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, their bond only grew stronger. On an ordinary day that turned eerie, Mason began noticing peculiar behaviors in Loki, his once easygoing, quiet dog. Loki had always been close to Jocelyn, Mason's daughter, but recently things had taken a troubling turn. Every time Jocelyn would try to step out of the room, Loki's gaze would sharpen, his eyes following her every movement, and if she dared to leave his sight, he'd whimper, even let out piercing barks that echoed through the house. Jocelyn felt torn between amused and annoyed by Loki's antics at first, but as days went on, the intensity of Loki's attachment only grew. It wasn't just the barking. Loki seemed to have made it his mission to be wherever Jocelyn was, glued to her side, blocking her steps, and constantly circling her as if he were guarding her from some invisible threat. If she went to the kitchen, Loki would trot beside her, his eyes darting around, alert. If she stepped out of the house, he'd paw at the door, whining so loudly that Mason had begun worrying about complaints from the neighbors. "Dad, Loki's being so strange," Jocelyn mentioned one evening, as Loki lay curled at her feet, staring up at her with an unsettlingly intense gaze. Mason had noticed it too. He'd seen Loki's behavior shift from loyal companionship to something that felt almost like obsession. In some moments, it seemed as if Loki was defending Jocelyn, placing himself protectively between her and any perceived danger. But other times, it felt as if he just couldn't bear to be separated from her for even a few minutes. One afternoon, after Jocelyn had stepped into the next room, Mason caught Loki frantically clawing at a cushion, tearing it open with his teeth. It wasn't like Loki to destroy anything. He was usually so well-behaved. This new behavior left Mason both concerned and confused as he watched Loki sit back, his chest heaving, as if even this small separation had set off some deep, uncontrollable anxiety. "I don't know, Dad," Jocelyn sighed, running her fingers through her hair. "It's like he can't stand it when I'm not there. Do you think he's sick or something?" Mason, frowning, thought over his options. He'd heard of animals displaying jealousy or territorial behavior before, especially if they'd experienced some kind of trauma or instability in the past. But this behavior felt beyond normal pet anxiety. It was as if Loki believed he had to protect Jocelyn from something only he could sense. Deciding it was best to be thorough, Mason took Loki to the vet, hoping for a straightforward answer. At the clinic, he described Loki's behavior in detail: the obsessive guarding, the refusal to let Jocelyn out of sight, the destruction whenever she wasn't there to calm him. After a thorough exam, the vet assured Mason that, physically, Loki was in perfect health. "Sometimes," she explained, "dogs can form particularly intense bonds with one person, especially if they've had difficult experiences before. Loki may be feeling some kind of residual anxiety, maybe tied to his past." The vet suggested Mason try working with an animal behaviorist. The idea seemed reasonable, though Mason had never considered it before. Driving back home, Mason kept glancing over at Loki in the rearview mirror, seeing the loyal but troubled dog in a new light. There was something deep in Loki's eyes, a kind of anxious attachment that had simmered below the surface all these years. Mason's heart ached for him. He knew he had to get to the root of it, not only for Loki's sake, but for Jocelyn's safety and peace of mind. As the door creaked open, the trainer stepped into Mason's modest living room, eyeing the nervous tension that filled the air. Mason had tried everything, yet his faithful dog, Loki, had become increasingly agitated around his daughter, Jocelyn. Loki's behavior hadn't just been a phase, it had morphed into a near obsession. "I'm not sure how else to put it," Mason said to the trainer, his voice barely concealing the edge of worry. "He's just different. He won't leave her alone, won't let her out of his sight. And it's not just protective, it's something else." The trainer gave a quiet nod, observing Loki, who lay by Jocelyn's feet, as though rooted to the spot. The moment the trainer stepped closer, Loki's ears twitched, eyes narrowing, sensing something that Mason couldn't see. Without warning, the dog sprang up, and in a flash threw himself against Jocelyn's legs, wrapping his paws around her like he was terrified of letting go. The abrupt movement knocked the air from the room. Loki's desperate howls echoed, piercing through the silent house. "Loki!" Mason shouted, rushing forward to pry the dog away from Jocelyn. But Loki resisted with an intensity that took Mason by surprise, a strength that seemed fueled by something more than instinct, something that almost felt like fear. As Mason pulled Loki back, he saw something that halted him, a tear rolling down Loki's face, gleaming in the dim light of the room. It was as though Loki, in his own way, was trying to say something. "What is going on, buddy?" Mason murmured, stunned. Loki looked up at him with the eyes wide, raw, with a grief Mason didn't understand, and yet, somehow, felt deep within himself. The trainer, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Mason, sometimes dogs can pick up on things that we humans don't see, especially when it comes to health. Changes, shifts, things that aren't always visible to the naked eye." Mason started, uncomprehending at first. "You mean, you think Loki's behavior is because of something wrong with Jocelyn? Something health-related?" The words sounded foreign, as though speaking them gave shape to a fear he had been unwilling to confront. Dogs can sense things, chemical changes, subtle shifts in a person's body, even things we can't pick up on ourselves, the trainer explained gently. Sometimes they get anxious, trying to warn us in the only way they know how. But what Loki's showing here, it's profound. The trainer's suggestion pierced Mason's heart, dredging up a memory he had tried to bury, the slow, creeping sickness that had taken his wife from them. The illness had manifested subtly at first, barely noticeable until it was too late. Mason's breath hitched as he looked back at Jocelyn, her face framed by curiosity mixed with confusion. He couldn't ignore it. This shadow that Loki seemed determined to shine a light on could no longer be pushed aside. The thought of Jocelyn facing something similar. It was unthinkable. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "We're getting this checked out," Mason said, his voice laced with urgency. He took Jocelyn's hand, squeezing it as though trying to press his strength into her. "We're going to the hospital, honey. Now." The trainer offered a reassuring nod as Mason and Jocelyn prepared to leave, Loki trotting anxiously beside them, as though sensing his message had finally broken through. In the sterile brightness of the hospital room, a chill seeped through Mason as he held his daughter's hand, waiting with her in silence. Jocelyn's face, usually full of laughter and light, now seemed lost in a quiet worry she couldn't yet voice. Finally, the door swung open and the doctor stepped in, clipboard in hand, a somber look etched onto his face. Mason's stomach clenched as he saw the doctor take a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Gray, I want to assure you that we've caught this early," the doctor began, his voice low, careful. "But it's not something to take lightly. Jocelyn has early-stage lung cancer." Mason felt the words hit him like a cold slap. Lung cancer, the same disease that had taken his wife, Jocelyn's mother. A vision of her flashed in his mind, her gentle smile lingering even through her final days, and a fresh wave of fear gripped him. He looked over at Jocelyn, seeing her as she'd been, the child they'd brought into the world full of hope. How could this cruel cycle be repeated? Mason felt his body go cold, his mind racing with thoughts, memories, and the ache of something unspeakable. The image of Loki's restless behavior, the destruction he had caused, suddenly surged through his mind. Each incident with Loki seemed to echo back, tied to the moments when Jocelyn's cough would intensify, when her breath grew ragged. A painful realization struck him, hard. Loki had been warning them all along, yet Mason had brushed it aside, too absorbed in his own world to see the signs. Jocelyn turned her gaze away, staring at the muted patterns on the hospital wall as though each line held a clue, a way out. Her expression was blank, but Mason sensed the heartbreak beneath the surface, a vulnerability she wasn't yet ready to show. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on Mason's shoulder. "The good news," he continued, "is that we caught it early. With treatment, Jocelyn has a strong chance of recovery." Those words, though comforting, didn't lessen the guilt gnawing at Mason. How could he have ignored the signs Loki had tried so hard to show him? That loyal dog had sensed it, fought against the silence, the ignorance, and tried to bring their attention to the silent danger lurking within Jocelyn's lungs. Later that night, as Mason led Jocelyn back home, Loki bounded up to them, his tail wagging with a cautious joy, as though he sensed the weight of what had transpired. Mason knelt down, ruffling the fur between Loki's ears, a quiet respect in his gesture. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered, feeling an odd warmth rise up from somewhere deep within him. "Thank you for taking care of her in a way I couldn't." As they entered the house, Mason made a silent promise to himself and to Jocelyn. This was a journey they'd endure as a family, facing each challenge, each treatment, each hopeful step forward. And now he knew he wasn't alone in his resolve. Loki would be there too, watching over her, faithfully by her side. The room was bathed in an unnatural silence. Mason's eyes never strayed far from Jocelyn, lying pale and fragile on the hospital bed, her once bright, spirited self dimmed by months of grueling treatments. Mason let work go. Old plans dissolved like mist. All that mattered now was here, in this sterile room, where hope was the fragile lifeline he clung to. Mason tried to keep the room warm with small, constant gestures. A fresh cup of her favorite tea, a soft blanket he knew she loved. Every day was a battle, not just for Jocelyn, but for the spirit of the home they once knew. Each moment he spent by her side seemed to make up for all the moments he'd missed, all the times he'd chosen work over family, distraction over presence. Now he was here, fully, wholly, and that was all he wanted. Loki was there too, a silent sentinel, his brown eyes dark and soulful, as though he carried the weight of the world with him. Whenever Jocelyn's strength waned, when she'd fade into those dark spells of despair that came from the endless cycles of pain and recovery, Loki would sense it. He would curl up beside her, his head resting on her frail arm, his deep breaths matching the rhythm of hers, grounding her in a way words never could. It was as if he spoke a language of his own, one that only she could understand. "I'm here, Jocelyn," Mason would murmur, when he saw her fading, his voice choking but steady. "Loki's here too. We're not going anywhere." Those were the words she clung to, even when her hands felt too weak to reach for him. And Loki, silent but present, somehow did more than words ever could. The loyal companion had become a bridge between Mason and Jocelyn, a connection that kept them all whole. The days passed slowly, each a trial of patience and hope. Mason had never known fatigue like this, yet each time he saw Jocelyn's small but significant progress, it renewed his resolve. She had begun to eat a little more, to smile just faintly when Loki would nudge her hand for a gentle pat. And for Mason, these were victories as grand as any success he'd ever known. Each breath, each small step toward recovery was a precious gift, one that he guarded fiercely. Loki had become an embodiment of hope, a symbol of resilience, and there was a quiet pride in Mason's heart whenever he saw Jocelyn and Loki, both fighting in their own ways. After what felt like an eternity, the doctors began to see improvement. "We're seeing some positive changes," they'd say, and Mason felt a weight lift from his chest, one that had been suffocating him since the diagnosis. But the journey was still arduous. The fear still crept into the edges of his thoughts late at night. Through it all, Mason kept a vigil beside her, watching, praying, sometimes simply breathing alongside Loki, who had become as much a part of this battle as any of them. Months passed, and Jocelyn grew stronger. The day she walked on her own, fragile but smiling, was the first time Mason felt like he could exhale. Loki bounded beside her, his tail wagging, his joy as pure and uncontained as a child's. The three of them, bound by love and survival, shared a moment of silent gratitude. Mason looked at Loki, knowing that this dog, this faithful companion, had given them back a part of their family. Jocelyn's recovery wasn't just a victory over illness, it was a return to life. The house that once echoed with silence now filled with laughter again, and for Mason, every moment was as fragile and precious as glass. Loki had saved them all in his quiet, loyal way, and Mason knew that, thanks to him, they'd faced down the unthinkable and come out stronger. The morning sun cast a gentle light through the curtains as Jocelyn stretched in her bed, breathing in the quiet warmth of a home that had, for too long, been shadowed by fear and uncertainty. It had been a journey she'd never imagined, one that took her to the brink and back. But there she was, and by her side, her father, Mason, and Loki, their loyal, four-legged companion, watched with steadfast gazes that spoke more than words ever could. Loki, whose expressive brown eyes carried hints of both wisdom and mystery, sat near the bed, with his tail wagging softly against the floor. For months, he had been Jocelyn's silent anchor, the one constant presence that seemed to understand the things no one else could see. It was as if he had known something she didn't, as if his intuition had saved her when science could not. Loki's loyalty had become a story in itself, a testament to the bond between them that had formed like an invisible tether, pulling her back to life, to her family, to herself. Mason, standing at the foot of Jocelyn's bed, held his hands together, looking at his daughter with a softness in his eyes that he rarely showed. It had been his heart that broke first, watching Jocelyn slip away slowly, fearing he might lose her, just like he had lost so much before. But Loki had pulled them all through, as if the dog had seen what no one else could, and had taken it upon himself to be her shield, her savior. With Jocelyn finally on the mend, Mason felt it was time to celebrate the second chance they'd been given. He wanted to honor Loki in a way that showed just how grateful they were to the dog who had, quite literally, given them hope. Mason started planning a small gathering, something intimate, where they could share Loki's story, a story that, in Mason's mind, was nothing short of miraculous. As the day of the gathering arrived, friends and family gathered in their modest living room, each bringing with them an eagerness to hear the tale they had only caught whispers of. Mason looked around the room, his gaze finally settling on Loki, who sat, proud and humble, at Jocelyn's side. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady but soft. "Loki isn't just a dog to us," Mason said, glancing at Jocelyn, who watched her father with a deep, quiet admiration. "He's been our guardian, our light, and in many ways, the heart of our home." He paused, letting his words settle over the room. Each person listened intently, eyes moving between Mason and Loki, whose wagging tail seemed to beat in time with the rhythm of the words. "We had been through so much before Loki came into our lives, but it was his actions, the way he seemed to know, somehow. That saved Jocelyn." When things were at their worst, Loki never left her side, not even for a moment. Jocelyn's eyes shone as she reached down to stroke Loki's head, feeling the rough warmth of his fur against her fingertips. She remembered the moments when Loki had nudged her hand, licked her cheek, or simply sat with her, refusing to leave. To her, it was clear. Loki had felt her pain in ways that words couldn't convey, in ways that transcended the usual connection between human and animal. As the story came to an end, there was a collective hush in the room, a shared sense of awe and appreciation. Mason looked around, his heart swelling with gratitude as he saw the love in the faces of those gathered. Loki had brought them not just a story, but a lesson in the power of love and loyalty, in the bonds that hold people and animals together through the hardest of times. With a soft smile, Mason raised his glass. "To Loki," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for being more than we ever knew we needed, for giving us back what we thought we'd lost." Everyone raised their glasses, and Jocelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. This wasn't just a gathering. It was a moment that would stay with her forever, a moment that honored the strength, resilience, and love that had pulled her through. As the gathering dispersed, the family sat together in the quiet, their hearts bound even more tightly, knowing that Loki's watchful eyes would always be there, a guardian, a friend, and a reminder of the miracle they had witnessed together. And that, folks, is the incredible story of Loki and the family he saved in ways no one could have ever imagined. It's a powerful reminder of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, and how sometimes they see things we don't. If you found this story as moving as I did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves their furry friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. Have you ever had a pet who seemed to know just what you needed, even when you couldn't say it? Or maybe a time when your pet did something that seemed almost miraculous? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, who knows? Maybe I'll feature your story in a future video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned for more incredible tales that just might change the way you see the world. See you in the next one.